There's a point in the Pacific Ocean so remote that the nearest humans to it usually aren't on Earth at all. They're astronauts passing by on the International Space Station, roughly 400 kilometers overhead. The nearest land is more than 2,600 kilometers away in every direction. It's called Point Nemo, Latin for no one, and for decades it served an entirely different purpose too. It's where space agencies deliberately crash their dead satellites and retired space stations, far from any ship, plane, or person. Today we're breaking down exactly where Point Nemo is, why it became a graveyard for spacecraft, and what's actually happening beneath the surface of the most isolated spot on the planet. Quick question before we continue. If you had to guess, how far from land do you think the most remote point on Earth actually is? Drop your guess in the comments before we get to the real number. If you're new here, subscribe, because we break down fascinating Earth science stories like this using verified sources only. Let's push this video to 5,000 likes so more people learn about this incredible place. Where is Point Nemo, and how was it found? Point Nemo sits at coordinates 48°52.6, south 123°23.6. West in the South Pacific Ocean, roughly between South America, Australia, and Antarctica. It's officially known as the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, the single point on the ocean's surface that sits farthest from any landmass. According to reporting from NOAA and multiple geographic sources, the nearest land to Point Nemo consists of 3 points, each roughly 2,688 kilometers, about 1,670 miles away. Ducie Island, part of the Pitcairn Islands to the north, Motu Nui, one of the Easter Islands to the northeast, and Mare Island off the coast of Antarctica to the south. The point sits at nearly equal distance from all three, which is actually the mathematical definition of a pole of inaccessibility, the spot balanced as far as possible from the nearest three landmasses. Point Nemo was identified in 1992 by a Croatian-Canadian survey engineer named Hrvoje Lukatela, who used computer geospatial analysis to calculate the coordinates. He named it after Captain Nemo, the reclusive submarine captain from Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a fitting reference since Nemo means no one in Latin. Point Nemo's extreme remoteness is exactly what made it useful to space agencies. Since the early 1970s, NASA, the Russian space program, the European Space Agency, and Japan's space agency have all used the waters around Point Nemo as a designated crash zone for spacecraft that are being deliberately deorbited, brought back down through the atmosphere in a controlled way once they've reached the end of their working life. According to a widely cited 2021 report and reporting from outlets covering the region, more than 263 spacecraft have been sent to this general area since 1971, including Russia's Mir space station and roughly 140 Russian resupply vehicles, along with European and Japanese cargo craft and other retired hardware. It's worth being precise here, though. Recent reporting has clarified that this isn't a single debris pile sitting directly under the Point Nemo coordinate. Instead, it's a broad, elongated re-entry zone, since different spacecraft follow different descent paths and break apart at different altitudes, scattering surviving fragments across an area that can stretch nearly 1,000 miles. The reason agencies use this method is straightforward. A spacecraft that's too large to safely burn up completely in the atmosphere needs to come down somewhere, and directing it toward the most human empty patch of ocean on the planet minimizes the risk of debris striking a person, a ship, or an aircraft. The area near Point Nemo was chosen specifically because it's not just far from land. It's also rarely crossed by shipping lanes or flight paths. To put the isolation in perspective, astronauts aboard the International Space Station orbit at roughly 400 kilometers above Earth. When the ISS passes over Point Nemo, those astronauts are actually closer to that patch of ocean than the nearest human beings on the surface of the planet, who are over 2,600 kilometers away. This is genuinely one of the more striking facts about Point Nemo. The closest people to it, at almost any given moment, are in space. The ocean depth around Point Nemo is also notable, reported at around 4,000 meters, roughly 13,000 feet, deep. And looking ahead, the International Space Station itself is expected to be deliberately crashed in the same spacecraft cemetery when it's finally retired, with different sources citing a target window somewhere between 2028 and 2031. When a spacecraft is deorbited, engineers use its remaining fuel to slow it down just enough that it falls out of orbit and begins descending through the atmosphere. As it does, friction with the air heats the spacecraft's surface to extreme temperatures, and most of the structure burns up completely, which is why smaller satellites often leave little to no debris at all. Larger structures, like a space station, are built with heavier and more heat-resistant components that don't fully disintegrate. These pieces survive re-entry and fall to the ocean's surface, sometimes at high speed, because different parts of a spacecraft separate and fall at different points along its descent path. The surviving debris doesn't land in one tidy spot. It spreads out over what can be a very long stretch of ocean, following the aircraft's ground track. That's why researchers now describe the cemetery as more of a broad disposal region than a single wreck site. There's also an environmental question worth noting. While most spacecraft are built from largely inert materials like aluminum, titanium, and stainless steel, some contain residual amounts of hydrazine, a toxic rocket propellant, or in rare cases, radioactive components, which some researchers say could pose a localized pollution risk at the ocean floor, though this remains an area of ongoing study. Point Nemo is one of several so-called poles of inaccessibility recognized around the world, geographic extremes defined by distance rather than by borders or landmarks. Its land-based counterpart, the continental pole of inaccessibility, sits in northwestern China near the Kazakhstan border and is the point on land farthest from any ocean, about 2,645 kilometers from the nearest coastline. What sets Point Nemo apart from other remote places, like the middle of the Sahara Desert or the depths of Siberia, is that those locations, however isolated, still exist, within reach of roads, research stations, or nearby populations eventually. Point Nemo has none of that. No permanent structures, no regular traffic, and no practical way to reach it except by a dedicated ocean voyage of many days. Point Nemo's role as a spacecraft graveyard isn't going away. If anything, it's expected to become more prominent in the coming years. With the International Space Station scheduled for eventual retirement sometime in the 2028-2031 window, space agencies are already planning the controlled deorbit that will send it to the same general waters as Mir, and hundreds of other retired spacecraft before it. Researchers also continue to study the long-term environmental impact of decades of spacecraft disposal in this remote stretch of ocean, an area of research likely to grow as more debris accumulates. Point Nemo is a strange kind of landmark, a place defined entirely by what isn't there. No island, no outpost, no permanent structure marks it, and yet it's become one of the most quietly significant spots on the planet, chosen again and again by engineers looking for the one place on Earth truly empty enough to catch what falls from space. If you could visit the most remote place on Earth, would you actually want to go? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe so you catch our next deep dive into the strangest corners of our planet. And let's hit that 5,000 like goal together. See you in the next one.